first inning is the most runs are scored in the first inning of games, and it also you get through the heart of their order the first time. And if you can get the heart of their order out, that's one less time you have to face them. And so that's why they've come up with this idea to bring these, or they have this other. They have a couple other pitchers who throw routinely 97, 98, and they use them for the first inning. But the reason they don't use them more is because that's all they can do.
Right, they're gassed after 20 pitches.
Yeah, you can't rely on them to become, to be a starting pitcher and still be around in the seventh inning because they're not good enough to be around in the seventh inning. So they call it their bullpen days. I call it the bum of the inning club.
Well, that was Friday's article, which I'm glad you brought up because that was the other thing I wanted to talk about because I can't imagine Tom Seaver pitching, one of the greatest pitchers in the world being taken out in the sixth inning no matter what. Well, the fifth inning.
God. Don't ever talk to him about that because we've had these conversations now for the past 4 or 5 years, and Seaver's just apoplectic about what's happened to starting pitchers.
You think that it gets the impression that there's never going to be a 300-win pitcher again because they come out too early,
right.
or getting a complete game.
15 seasons of 20 wins.
Right.
Who's getting that? Nobody. Nobody's getting 300 wins anymore.
Hey, Tom Seaver went 10 innings in Game 4 of the '69 World Series.
Yeah,
they didn't pull him out. You didn't see Gil Hodges taking him out.
That was when pitchers were
pitchers.
Bill. Here's the other thing that I wanted to mention to you because I when I read the bum of the inning article, obviously it makes a lot of sense. But is this trend and also the trend that most teams seem to be using now about shuffling relief pitchers up and down through the minor leagues? Does this make starting pitchers less valuable? Because now you have guys that are all they're being asked to do these days is go 5 or 6 innings or maybe 7 at the most, and then they turn the game over to the bullpen anyway. But with what the Rays are doing now, it's just maybe you have 12 or 13 pitchers on the roster, but a team is really probably using 16 or 17 pitchers because the last 2 or 3 or 4 of those guys seem like the old Columbus shuttle that the Yankees had. But that's what they're doing. It's like they'll send down 2 guys to bring up 2 fresh arms, and then those guys will be there for a few days or a week, and then they get sent back down to bring the other guys back up, and it's just this big revolving door. So does that make starters less valuable today than maybe they were 10, 20 years ago?
There's no question about it. I mean, this is the baseball has just gotten so crazy when it comes to starting pitchers. They're still paying them more. I mean, look at some of these contracts these guys. Darvish. I mean, my God, look at that contract.
Yeah, David Price too.
David Price. And yet, you're right. The diminishing of starting pitchers is, to me, in my opinion, the worst thing that's happened to baseball. Because, I'll give you a good example. I mean, what a ridiculous situation yesterday. The Rays. The Rays bum of the inning club beat Verlander yesterday. The best pitcher in baseball lost to the bum of the inning club. He actually had a bad second inning. He gave up about 3 or 4 runs in the first couple innings, but his team but the Astros couldn't score against all this menagerie of pitchers that the Rays brought in, and unfortunately, as I wrote in the column the other day, I said, the worst part about this is other clubs are going to start doing the same thing. And you're going to see this all over baseball now because there's not enough starting pitchers to go around.
Right. But of course, when the Mets decided to try it, what happened? Jerry Blevins gives up home runs to the first 2 guys he faces.
Well, that's the story of the Mets this year.
Exactly.
They're bum of the inning clubs. They were bums. They gave up 7 home runs.
That was an amazing game.
Well, that's the reason I call it that, because if you remember, years ago, and for the first 100 years of baseball, if you were not a starting pitcher, if you were in the bullpen, you were in the bullpen for a reason, because you weren't good enough to be a starting pitcher. That's what relievers were.
Right, the starters were expected to go 9 innings.
Right, with the exception of a few closers like Elroy Face or later on Raleigh Fingers and people like that. Hiller with the Tigers.
Right.
Most of the relievers in teams' bullpens were guys that weren't just they were there because they were better than people in the minor leagues, maybe, but not good enough to be in the starting rotation. They weren't good enough to be starters.
That's a good point.
And then they would hope to get a couple of outs or an inning out of them if for whatever reason the starter was tired or couldn't continue for whatever reason.
They were usually guys that came into the games when the team was losing.
Right.
They didn't have. It was La Russa back in the '80s with the A's who started the whole thing with the setup relievers and everything else with Darryl Mills and Lindblad setting up for Eckersley.
Right.
And that's when it started to get more complicated as far as the way relievers were being used. But now it's just completely out of hand.
How else do you think that analytics can destroy baseball?
I think they've already done a pretty good job of it.
I was going to say, what are you looking for suggestions over here?
No, just Tim and I talk about analytics a lot, and I'm for the pitcher going to the 8th or the 9th inning because that's what I grew up on, and I know these pitchers probably have it in them, especially since they're going 5 days, not 4 days. Tom Seaver went every 4th day, and it just if you have these great starting pitchers, you should use them. Instead of 5 innings, might as well make him a starter reliever. Okay, we're going to use him next day as a reliever and get an inning out of him. So that's just my view of it.
Before I came on the air with you guys, I was watching the Rays game this afternoon against the Astros, the third game of this series, and Charlie Morton was pitching a brilliant game. He was 6 2/3 innings, and a couple of Rays got on with 2 outs in the 7th inning, and A.J. Hinch goes on what I love to call the constant search for the one guy who doesn't have it. And he brings in a relief pitcher, and Matt Duffy hits the first pitch into right field for a 2-run double, and poor Charlie Morton was set up for a win, and now he's going to get either a loss or
Well, think about DeGrom. This guy's the best pitcher ERA in the league, and he never wins games because he gets pulled out too early, and then someone else comes in and blows his lead.
The Mets haven't scored for him, that happened with Zach Wheeler the other day. He threw 7 shutout innings, and then what happened? The Mets bullpen gave up 5 runs in the last 2 innings. Well,
that's the other thing with these managers. If you know you don't have a bullpen, why do you go on like I said, the constant search for the one guy who doesn't have it?
Right.
When your starting pitcher is mowing them down and pitching well and has you in position to win the game, why do you take him out and go to an inferior pitcher? You're asking for it.
Yeah, it seems like managers. I don't necessarily want to use the word panic, but maybe it is a little panic. Once the pitcher gets to around 100 pitches, I think a lot of them start to think, well, we have to get him out. Well, if the guy is still being effective and getting outs and not giving up runs, why take him out? If it means having a pitcher go to 115 or 120 pitches, do it. He's your guy. If he's getting guys out, let him keep getting guys out until he shows you he can't.
Well, guys like Seaver and Bob Gibson and Nolan Ryan, all of my guys, they laugh at this.
I'm sure they do.
Seaver told me that, I said, what was your pitch count? What was your limit? And Seaver said, my limit was probably around 140, 150.
Wow.
And he said Nolan's was a little bit higher. He could probably go 160. They didn't do pitch counts back then. But
that's 2 games
I don't think Seaver was exaggerating.
I don't either.
I don't think so either.
Because he was a high-octane pitcher. He had a lot of strikeouts in his games. And when you have a lot of strikeouts, you're going to throw a lot of pitches.
Right.
So, that's the way it was. And there's no reason why it couldn't still be that way. But baseball has decided we're going to baby these guys from the moment we sign them out of high school or college. And they're going to be put on pitch counts, and they are taught in the minor leagues that when it comes to when you're done with 5 innings, now it's 5 innings.
Yeah.
In the minor leagues, it used to be 6 or 7 innings. Your job is done. Your pitch count's going to be around 100. Don't worry about it. Your job is done. They are not trained to go any further than that.
Oh, in A-ball, it's even worse than that, Bill. The 8 starters in A-ball now are going 3 or 4 innings. It's ridiculous. I don't know what does that teach a young pitcher? You want these guys to build up stamina, but you're only throwing in 3 or 4 innings and having them throw maybe 60 pitches and say, okay, yeah, we want to make sure that you don't hurt yourself, but you don't develop. You can't develop stamina and a willingness or a knowledge of, all right, now I'm going to get to the 7th inning. I don't have the same octane that I had in the 1st inning, but I still have to get guys out. So how do I figure this out, how to do it? And they don't teach that in the minor leagues nowadays.
No, they don't.
No. And all these guys that you talk to, the great pitchers from the 50s and 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, all the great pitchers that are all in the Hall of Fame, they'll all tell you the same thing. The secret to their ability to amass all these wins and pitch as well as they did for as long as they did was because they pitched, they threw.
Right.
And that's the whole thing. Warren Spahn talked about that all the time with me, with anybody he talked to. He said, my secret was I pitched. I threw between innings. That's because I built my arm. I kept my arm built up. Now it's just the other way around. They baby them, and what happens? They all get hurt anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
Half of them need Tommy John surgery.
We're talking with Bill Madden of the New York Daily News. Bill, before we let you go, as I was getting the articles out from the last 2 weeks, I came across a really touching article you wrote about Rusty Staub when he died. You were good pals with him. What should people remember about Rusty besides the great ribs, and the fact that he actually
he was a great hitter too.
He was, but those ribs were really good. But if he had a couple of more good seasons, he would have, I think, been in the Hall of Fame.
Unfortunately for Rusty, the biggest mistake he ever made was coming back to the Mets when he was a free agent, and he told me that once that he was and actually remained bitter about it, because Frank Cashin promised him at the time that he was going to be their everyday first baseman.
Right.
And then shortly thereafter, he brought in Dave Kingman. And so Rusty was relegated to pinch hitting duty. And the other thing was, if he'd have stayed in Detroit, he got into a salary squabble with Jim Campbell, the general manager of the Tigers. Now, Rusty was always a tough negotiator. He didn't get along with too many general managers in his career. And this was a case of that. And if he'd have stayed in Detroit instead of leaving there and instead in the American League, he would have easily gotten 3,000 hits as a designated hitter.
Yep.
And he would have been a shoo-in in the Hall of Fame. So
Absolutely.
That's what happened to him. But, I think we'll all look back on Rusty as a player, and I think we'd all agree he was one of the great natural hitters of our lifetime.
I thought so. He had 2,716 hits. And, if you think about from 81 to 85, he could have really added on those years. You're right, if he hadn't come back to the Mets.
Well, if Cashin had kept his word to him,
right.
The first baseman.
Exactly.
But that's what happened there, and so it cost him the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I don't know if he's in the Mets Hall of Fame, but he should be because he was on 9 years with the team. So,
well, he's in the Mets Hall of Fame.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure because they don't really promote that too much. They like to promote the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Right.
Bill, we thank you for joining us. The third time is fantastic.
Always a charm.
We hope to have you on again, maybe when the documentary comes out. Hopefully before that. We love talking baseball with you. And,
okay.
We should have Bill and Tom Seaver on at the same time.
Well,
Bill, make that happen.
I'll see what I can do, guys.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it.
You've been on more than Phil Pepe, on daily. More than Christy Ackard, but
another Daily News legend, Phil Pepe.
We had Phil on twice. We're always happy to have you on, and we appreciate you coming on. And we hope to have you on sooner than later.
Okay, guys.
Thanks a lot, man.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All hit music.
For all those songs radio has forgotten about. Join me, Big Ed, Mondays from 10 a.m. till noon for The Good Gold Show. We'll bring back all the great hits of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and more. The sounds of doo-wop to disco, all the Motown, soul, and great rock and roll. We'll even take your requests and dedications to The Good Gold Show.
Music.
On the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and streaming on the iHeartRadio app.
A Super Bowl champion,